Hey, it's Brett, and this is uh, the 2020 Uprising. That's not how it happened. An overview of the Mariame, Kaba, and Andrea Ritchie's No More Police by Riot Muffin, published May 31st, 2023. And as a note, I haven't read No More Police, as I recall, so I'm going to have to look it up. Um, Try to put it up here. Like many other books and articles that I've been reading, one thing leads to three others. So I'm trying to catch up on the references, and as I do that, you'll start seeing my page building out from those areas. And this first section of the zine is "That's Not How It Happened." 3 years later, Minneapolis participants in the George Floyd uprising are consistently lied to from multiple directions about the reality of those inspiring, earth shaking days in 2020 and the aftermath. We hear the reactionary law and order narrative that the uprising was nothing but senseless destruction, leaving Minneapolis a barren wasteland and the police defunded, if only. We hear the liberal fantasy that everything happened good that happened, including the storming of the third precinct, was actually done by white supremacists. And also, we hear the story advanced by many police abolitionists, such as in Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie's Fall 22 book, No More Police, that it was organizers and nonprofits responsible for pushing abolition into mainstream conversation thanks to their petitioning, peaceful marching, and meeting with city council members. I picked up an early copy of No More Police before it came out in the fall of 2022, intending to determine which chapters might be best suited for study groups or political education of various sorts, and I'll get to that later in this essay. What what new materials or lessons had been incorporated since Kaba's previous book, Why Do or We Do This Till We Free Us. But as I sat in a park not far from George Floyd Square, writing the first draft of this overview after several false starts, I had a hard time getting past my rage at the revisionist history that frames and permeates No More Police. Flipping again through Kaba and Ritchie's introduction to the foreword by Miski Noor and Candace Montgomery, leaders of Black Visions, the both celebrated and side-eyed Minneapolis nonprofit whose leadership was, as I write my first draft, busy failing to recognize a staff unionization effort. I became paralyzed at the disconnect between the reality my friends and I lived versus their telling of the uprising. In their story, massive protests were augmented by a petition demanding defunding of the police. Then, the movement in defense of black lives achieved one of its first abolitionist wins. A veto proof majority of the Minneapolis City Council supported uh, an amendment to disband the MPD. This is, of course, false. The council members present at that now widely derided rally in Powderhorn Park did not support such a measure, as their immediate backtracking in the days to follow made clear. Their pledge was calculated to quell the ungovernability of the streets. Every single council member present later voted for at least one measure that either modestly or significantly increased police funding. Reading this, I think of the long hours of toxic gas and less lethals endured by people posted up behind blockades made of shopping carts from May 26 to 28, 2020. I think of the courageous looting and arsons that enabled the Third Precinct siege by spreading public safety resources thin throughout the metro area. I think of Calvin Horton, murdered by a vigilante pawnshop owner, and Montez Lee, Dylan Robinson, and others still behind bars for their actions in these days. I think of friends who helped George Floyd Square barricades during sub-zero nights the following winter, heeding the call, no justice, no streets, only to be betrayed, pooh-poohed and even assaulted and exiled by organizers who gave up the occupation of the square next spring. Then I think of how we took the streets after the murders of Dalal Id, Winston Smith, and others, when many organizers, so quick to claim credit for the uprising, were either nowhere to be found or actively peace policed us. At those demonstrations, the Police 2.0 groups, We Push for Peace, Agape, A Mother's Love, and others, funded by the abolitionist nonprofit Big Victory, a few $1 million given to the city's Office of Police Prevention, assaulted comrades while screaming misogynist, homophobic, and transphobic slurs. And I also think of those, usually anonymous, militants who, despite repeated trauma and setbacks, are keeping up the drumbeat of resistance today, with graffiti and street art, through covert actions like attacks on police precincts and arsons against those responsible for camp evictions, through political education groups that tell the stories of mainstream leftist publishers won't ever. They, not the nonprofits or the celebrity organizers, are the reason that despite an increase in MPD funding since 2020, MPD has lost over 300 officers, a 33% reduction. If this litany sounds like I am bitter, it is because I cannot help feeling so. Seeing the rewriting of history here in Minneapolis has made so many of us feel that way. No More Police frames itself from the beginning around a false story of 2020 uprising. If you thought that this much-hyped book hitting stores in fall 2022 would center itself on something other than the analyzed ad nauseum events of the uprising, or at least substantially address some of the most brutal lessons learned since then, sadly, you'd be wrong. Let's dive into the book. Chapter by chapter of No More Police. Thankfully, there's still quite a bit of value in the book, mostly for those newer to abolitionist ideas, so long as it's not treated as a definitive text. Chapters 1 and 2, Cops Don't Stop Violence, and We Are Survivors, are a fairly solid Police Abolition 101-102, useful for sharing with someone who isn't quite there yet. The past 2 years have seen many similar pieces elsewhere to Cops Don't Stop Violence, including by Kaba and Ritchie themselves. This chapter doesn't bring much new to the discussion for folks who are already abolitionists. We Are Survivors is grounded in the author's own experience as survivors of sexual assault and advocates for other survivors, with ample stories and history to effectively address the carceral arguments usually offered on behalf of survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and other harms. It would be a good launching point for anyone wanting to improve how you approach and discuss police and prison abolition from a survivor-centric perspective. Chapter 3, Reform, correctly positions reform as an enemy strategy. Again, nothing new, but likely useful material to share with those unsure where to devote their anti-police efforts, or what she now calls a police preservationist, a term worthy of entering everyday lexicon to describe reformers. The authorities say, "We became abolitionists in part by listening to people on the receiving end of reforms." And, as the reader can see from their stories of involvement in past reformist initiatives gone awry, this is clearly true. They skewer the idea of community policing and a both-and approach to abolition, writing, "Abolitionists are called dreamers, but it is the promise of reform that works as a fantasy." The book starts to tackle some tougher questions with Chapter 4, No Soft Police, sometimes taking a deep dive, but sometimes glossing over critical questions. The chapter begins with a cartoon highlighting the shared root of words like police and policy, asking, "Have you ever been policed by an official who wasn't a cop?" Their point is that other spheres of state influence like education, health, and urban planning can also represent forms of policing. This echoes the calls of many total abolitionists who say policing is not just police and should be clearly named as the force we are up against. Yet, despite writing, imagining a future without policing is not the same as a future without police. The authors don't fully make that logical jump into a frame that addresses all forms of policing and social control. Despite their solid criticism of carceral social work, institutionalist mental health treatment, and child welfare systems, they leave out the nonprofit industrial complex and electoralism as two of the major sites of modern-day social control. Not coincidentally, these two sites are where many post-2020 self-proclaimed abolitionists conduct the bulk of their work, making this omission particularly troubling. And these sites of recuperation are largely responsible for how Minneapolis ended up where it is 3 years later, with a regressive city bureaucracy manufacturing progressive consent for rebuilding the third precinct and a brutal status quo that it represented. Despite making the police policy connection, the pathways offered in Chapter 5, How Do We Get There, toward a police-free future, are mostly, indeed, policy ones. It's rooted in the divest, invest, defund, refund framework, and is really more about how the authors envision from an abolitionist future than any concrete strategies for getting there. Participating in active, confrontational resistance to police and other forms of social control is treated only with an outside gaze, with at best passive participation advocated. Quote, shifting core beliefs about public safety often requires more than talking. This can include experiencing or witnessing the full violence of policing, Ritchie and Kaba write. Quote, for instance, violent police response to protests can effectively shift perceptions among people who don't experience that everyday violence of policing as it manifests in daily Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities, end quote. They cite summit protests, Occupy, BLM, Standing Rock, and Summer 2020 as recent examples of intense police violence. Imagine if instead they had framed these events as experiencing or witnessing everyday people fighting back against police violence can help shift one's core beliefs about the possibility of abolishing police in our time, end quote. Indeed, 2 paragraphs later, the authors again place people under the boot of police violence as mere passive observers instead of potential rebels, whilst repeating a liberal retelling of the 2020 uprising. Quote, when police abandoned communities in Minneapolis to white supremacist violence in the midst of the 2020 uprisings and deliberately slowed their response to 911 calls to punish residents, people stepped up to keep each other safe, end quote. Here, we see that agency is given to police or policing functions only, not to people's liberatory anti-police actions. Quote, police abandoned communities, they say, where they could have accurately said, hostile communities forced police to retreat. Instead, while a small number of freelance white supremacists did take advantage of the uprising, the authors here ignore that the biggest white supremacist force in Minneapolis is the MPD. Enforcing the retreat of police from neighborhoods, white supremacist violence, including regular daily police harassment, arrest, and incarceration, in fact went down. People, quote, stepped up to keep each other safe, end quote, from the remaining police forces, and then from the National Guard occupation, from other city policing initiatives such as encampment sweeps, from the economic and physical insecurity of the intersecting capitalist and COVID plagues, and yes, the occasional vigilante white power chud, too. Accepting these statements from the population already inclined to support the police, we did not have to, quote, keep each other safe, end quote, from each other in the way the police and exclusionary neighborhood patrols claim to do, centering alternatives to policing that are themselves rooted in policy and social control, rather than activities all people can participate in, demonstrates the limitation of a worldview in which change is mostly driven by select activists and organizers, and police and policy initiatives they advocate for. Chapter 7, Experiment and Build, gives compelling examples of transformative justice, mutual aid, and community care work. But both this chapter and How Do We Get There fail to meaningfully discuss activities that are both not rooted in policy and that directly challenge police power. Minneapolis has not succeeded in reducing our police force by 33% because of legislative efforts, but by creating a hostile environment for the occupying forces. Through transformative justice and mutual aid, we may indeed threaten police power when rooted in total abolitionist practice. These things are not what motivated government to call the National Guard to uphold the legitimacy of policing. Occupations, looting, and attacks on infrastructure were what did that. The question of confronting state power is explored more in Chapter 6, Tricks and Tensions, which might be the best for sharing with your study group or political education circle, though perhaps intentionally it lacks firm conclusions. The chapter begins with a lengthy discussion of different viewpoints on whether a non-carceral state is possible or if states and policing are inextricably intertwined. Does rooting out policing require dismantling states in their entirety? The authors cite Clee Bentley, William C. Anderson, and others in presenting a case for yes, with Ruth Wilson Gilmore among those cited at length arguing no. Ultimately, the chapter does not urge one particular approach, instead opting to settle non-committally that, quote, regardless of where we land on the questions briefly explored here, as abolitionists, it is essential to expand our imaginations beyond our current conceptions of the state, end quote. The Tricks and Tensions chapter also gives an introductory interview of some of the ways the state has used demands for defunding and reimagining policing for recuperation and co-optation. The authors write, quote, as the popularity and public currency of abolitionist demands increased, police, politicians, and pundits also deployed pacification tactics to absorb, adapt to, undermine, and dissipate the threat they pose, including through the assimilation of organizers to the project of state bureaucracy, end quote. While noting municipal task forces on policing as one example of this, the chapter could have been strengthened by including the two most visible examples on the ground here in Minneapolis. The first is George Floyd Square, which as of this writing has long been a delight for the Minneapolis establishment. Now devoid of its militant elements, Mayor Jacob Frey, MPD, and their allies are simultaneously able to demonize GFS as a lawless, violent hub of disorder, while also using it as a backdrop for the advancement of their own propaganda initiatives. Frey himself appeared at the 2-year anniversary vigil honoring George Floyd, surrounded with an escort of heavily armed black supporters, members of nonprofits including a GAPE movement, paid in June 2021 to dismantle the square's barricades, and Minnesota freedom fighters. The square was used in the fall of 2022 as a host for a forum for candidates for Hennepin County prosecutor, and at the 3-year anniversary vigil, the new Minneapolis police chief, Brian O'Hara, stopped by for a photo op with no more consequence than some heckling. The second example, which the chapter could have discussed, is the failures and limitations of the Office of Violence Prevention, the city government alternative to police advocated for by now defunct abolitionist nonprofits, Black Visions, and Reclaim the Block. It, too, has become a useful tool of liberals and conservatives alike, equally ridiculed while also used to repress and recuperate. Never having had any intention of preventing violence that flows from state power downwards against the people, it's recently been renamed the Office of Neighborhood Safety. Kaba and Ritchie do note that, quote, a singular focus on city budgets doesn't just leave defund demands open to being co-opted or quashed by the state, it also leaves us open to being overwhelmed by backlash and disappointment when politicians fail to keep their promises as soon as the political winds shift, end quote. They continue, quote, campaigns to shrink police budgets and power rode a wave of protest in 2020, but when the wave subsided, organizers found themselves fighting uphill battles to defend and expand their wins when politicians began backtracking, end quote. These sentences reveal the limitations of the revisionist history of the worldview shared in No More Police. These campaigns did not merely ride a wave of protest, they rode the wave of ungovernability resulting from the burning of a police precinct and mass rioting. Politicians and big institutions have neither before nor since been compelled to feign support for abolition by mere protest alone. And with credit due to those organized groups like Nationally Critical Resistance and locally MPD 150 building a rhythm for abolition in certain small circles before 2020, alongside militants and revolutionaries who have done so for decades, the wins of 2020 were not the result of organizers alone, or even primarily. They were the result of ordinary people who took the offensive without asking for permission from the state nor from activists. And this is printed from the anarchistlibrary.org, which is a great resource for information. I always find cool new stuff to read there. If you have any opinions on what was read here, I appreciate your comments. It helps me to learn more when people ask questions I hadn't thought of. And it gives me an idea of what else to read next. So if you have any recommendations, I would appreciate that. But otherwise, please make sure you subscribe and like. I want to make a good resource available for people to get information they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to in traditional routes of information. So thank you and have a good day.